There's another form of energy that can be used. Generally, it's used in transport. It can be used for any production of electricity. This is a fossil fuel alternative. It's called hydrogen fuel cell. A hydrogen fuel cell works by a simple chemical reaction in which hydrogen is combined with oxygen, and that process releases energy. And so this is what's called a fuel cell. So you have, if you're using a fuel cell, you have some source of hydrogen. For example, in this diagram here, we have a hydrogen tank in this vehicle. Okay? And the hydrogen is then put into the fuel cell. Okay? At the same time, oxygen from the atmosphere enters the fuel cell, and the hydrogen and the oxygen interact, forming water. And that water is the only byproduct of a fuel cell. And that process, when the oxygen and hydrogen combine, that releases electrons, which generate electricity. And so a hydrogen fuel cell powered vehicle, for example, is low environmental impact. Right? There are no carbon dioxide emissions. The only waste product that's released from this are heat and water. And we can see here, we can see how a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle works. So there's a hydrogen tank, there's the fuel cell where electricity is produced, and then electricity from that fuel cell can be stored in a battery and then used to drive electric engines. So it's basically similar in some ways to an EV, but the energy, instead of being plugged in to fuel a battery, you're using the hydrogen from this tank to generate electricity for this battery. So the technology is relatively expensive to produce hydrogen. You need to put energy in to actually produce the hydrogen. And so that's one limiting factor to the adoption of these hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. There's also very little infrastructure for hydrogen fuel cells. Around the world, there's only around 1,000 hydrogen fueling stations. You see one here. In the U.S., it's primarily in California, or where you can actually buy and use fuel cell vehicles, and where there are hydrogen filling stations. There's, I think, 2 models, a Hyundai and a Toyota fuel cell vehicle that you can actually buy commercially or at retail, and then they have to be filled at a special hydrogen filling station. They're also used in East Asia somewhat, and some parts of Central Europe. And this is a clean fuel, but there is this sort of dilemma that you get into that we also are in for electric vehicles, is people are not willing to buy a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle if it has very limited fueling infrastructure. And at the same time, investments in the infrastructure are not going to take place until you have many hydrogen fuel cell vehicles on the road. So that's sort of a dilemma that's often faced in these sort of situations. Hydrogen also can be transported in pipelines. It's reactive. It's a very small atomic mass gas, so it can escape pretty easily. It also is combustible, and for example, the Hindenburg was an airship that was filled with hydrogen, and if you know anything about the Hindenburg, you know how that ended up. Obviously, modern hydrogen fuel cells have been engineered to avoid any of those safety issues.